Luis Bernico, I believe, wanted to know what the audiences were at these theaters, or who the audiences were at the theaters.
Gil, you want to take a quick stab at that?
Well, I don't know. I kind of imagine they wouldn't have been very different from the audiences when I was a kid going to the movies in the, late 1930s, 1940s. But I think most of these theaters are a lot earlier than that. They're before my time. And gosh, I think it was just the general population, except maybe for those theaters right around 96th and Broadway, because they really drew people from all over the city because it was a transportation hub. So
could I just add that I think the audience was everybody. I mean, all Americans went to the movies often,
yes.
70, 80 years ago. It was universal.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, guess what? We're ready to go full-time presentation mode. And again, we thank everyone who signed in, who tuned in a little bit early. We were live, but we were doing kind of a pre-program. We're going to begin now with the full official program. I think you're going to really, really enjoy it. This should be a special night. And again, it's recorded. So for those of our friends out there who enjoy local history or are interested in the local history of our Bloomingdale area as it relates to movie theaters, they'll be able to see a recording of this. But welcome officially now to the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group first Zoom presentation. This is our first. We'll probably be doing a few more of these until things improve with respect to the pandemic. This is entitled Bloomingdale Goes to the Movies, as you can see on the screen. Again, I'm Jim Mackin. I'm only one of about a dozen people called the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group. We do presentations, we do neighborhood tours, we archive history in the neighborhood. We do anything that celebrates the Bloomingdale local history. Bloomingdale is a large area. Historically, it actually ran from the West 40s all the way up to about 125th Street. But over time, in the 1800s, came to be known the West 90s, 100s. And so that's our general venue. The program, as I mentioned, will be recorded, and only 100 people will be able to get into it. I hope it doesn't frustrate anybody. But again, we're recording it, and you can see it after the fact on our website, which is upperwestsidehistory.org. Some of our future programs in October, we'll be having Ethel Sheffer. She was chairwoman of Community Board 7, and she'll be talking about her experience, her firsthand experience as head of the Riverside South Task Force. Sometime after that, we'll probably have a presentation on Seneca Village. We have a friend at the New York Historical Society who's going to give us some fresh insights on that. Back in May, we were supposed to have had Tom Miller. He's my favorite online historian, and his one book is just fabulous. His website is incredible. He was going to do a program for us about 3 buildings in great detail in our neighborhood that don't exist anymore. And he was going to give a detailed history. And that's the type of wonderful history that he does. So we hope to have him down the road. We'll plan for that. I have a book coming out on November 3rd called Notable New Yorkers of Manhattan's Upper West Side, Bloomingdale, and Morningside Heights. And so sometime in November, I'll do a presentation about my book, which covers 591 notable people in our neighborhood. And there's a website in it that references another 800 notable people. In addition, the book has maps and photographs and little tidbits of history that I hope you find interesting. So at the end of this presentation, we'll have questions and answers. Please, if you have a question, just put it into the chat. I think more people are getting used to this, but down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little icon that says chat. If you click on that, you'll be able to type in a question. But I gotta tell you, whenever we have a question about movie theaters, and I'm talking on behalf of Gil and Dan, myself, and all the other members of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group, we go to an old friend, Gary Dennis. Gary Dennis is a legend in our neighborhood when it comes to movie history. Gary used to run the movie place, which was a rental movie place that was by far the best in the city. And Gary's still very much involved in movie history. His tours by Gary are precious. If you Google that, you'll come up with Gary. You probably even recognize what he looks like if you remember going to the movie place. So we call upon him from time to time for useful information. Let me stop myself here. Let's get started right away with one of our Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group members who's done some wonderful analytical work. And I'm speaking of Dan Armstrong. Dan, you good to go?
I am. Thank you.
Let's do
Thank
it.
you, Jim.
Okay.
Okay, well, I'm going to start with the question. When was the last movie theater to be built in Bloomingdale? When was the most recent movie theater in our neighborhood? And the answer is 1933, when the Metro opened at 100th and Broadway. It was 87 years ago. Nothing has been built since. And the reason is here, right on this chart. This shows the percentage of Americans who went to the movies at least once a week. In 1930, when it starts, 2/3 of Americans went to the theater at least once a week. And among people living in cities like New York, with plenty of access to theaters, it was even more. It was like 80 or 90%. In rural areas, of course, they didn't go to the theaters as much. Then came the Depression, and fewer people could afford the movies. The economy turned back up. World War II, attendance went back up again. It had a recovery. But after the war, attendance fell, and it never recovered. So the big villain was TV. But there were other issues as well. Admission prices went up. I remember going to the Paris Theater in 1981, seeing that the admission was $5 and just turning and walking away. I wasn't going to pay $5 for a movie. People moved to the suburbs and the theaters were less accessible. And finally, this chart ends in the year 2000, but it's clear that attendance has fallen even more since then with DVDs, streaming media, and social media. So we're not sitting in the theater next to our neighbors watching Cary Grant anymore. We're walking around with our faces in our iPhones. Now we've seen the effects of that trend in Bloomingdale. This shows when the theaters in Bloomingdale opened and when they closed. They're all closed, except for one. So down the left, in chronological order, you see a list of 17 Bloomingdale movie theaters, starting with the Airdome and ending with the Metro. And across the bottom, you can see a timeline of dates from 1911 to 2006. And the bars show when the theaters existed. So blue bars, those are open air theaters. It's the Manhattan equivalent of drive-ins. Orange for theaters that no longer exist. Red for theaters that exist but don't show movies anymore, like the Symphony and the Metro. And the one green bar is the only theater in the neighborhood that's still open, or would be open if not for COVID. And even that theater is not in the original structure anymore. So here's the interesting thing about this chart. 2/3 of Bloomingdale's theaters were built in a 36-month period from 1911 to 1914. These theaters popped up overnight like weeds. Everybody wanted to go to the movies. And entrepreneurs were building theaters like mad to accommodate that demand. They built on rooftops, they built in vacant lots, they knocked down existing buildings. They were crazy to build theaters because everybody wanted to go to the movies. That was the Bloomingdale theater building boom. So here you see the modern Bloomingdale street grid. It stretched a little to run down to 94th Street because I didn't want to leave out the Symphony and the Thalia. But it's basically, the park to the river, 110th to 96th, but, with a couple blocks extra. Across the top, you see a timeline. So let's see when the theaters were built. Oops, 1911. We got 4 theaters, 2 of them down near the 96th Street subway, which had just opened 8 years before, a couple of open air theaters, and the Essex on 104th and Broadway, which when I moved to New York showed Spanish language porn. I'm sorry, 1913, 1912, okay. 1912, we got the Carlton Keystone. That's where the Sloan supermarket was through the 1990s. 1913, we got 4 more. Another one near the 96th Street subway, a couple of open air theaters, and the Essex on 104th and Broadway. 1914, we lost 2. We got the Olympia, and we got another rooftop open air theater. 1918, we got the Symphony, the precursor to Symphony Space. 1919, we got the Nemo, which you can see behind me. That's where H Mart is now. Another one in 1924, the Thalia in 1931, and one over on 104th in Columbus by the 9th Avenue L in 1932. And finally, we got the Metro, 1933, and then it ends. That's it for Bloomingdale movie theaters. Nothing has been built since. So now we're going to hear about individual theaters from Giltaber.
Wow, thanks, Dan. That was fabulous. And
I'm sorry. I have one more thing to say, if you don't mind. Okay. I'm sorry. I've got one more thing. I apologize. I know it sounded like I was about to end, but I haven't quite ended. Okay. Sorry, now we're going to hear about individual theaters from Giltaber. So I will leave you with this still from the movie Vanilla Sky. It's the muscle car murder-suicide of of Cameron Diaz and Tom Cruise. You see that they're about to die at 96th and Riverside in front of, what's that building? It's the Cliff Dwelling, 96th and Riverside. Okay, over to you, Gil.
thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you.
One passing thought is, of course, talking movies didn't come in till Warner Brothers' The Jazz Singer in 1927. So only 2 of those theaters were built after we had talking movies. But now, Gil, you're going to take us through a lot of the theaters, theater by theater. So let's hear what you got.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, Jim, about the fact that only 2 of those were built. Hold on. Only 2 of those were built after the coming of sound. So here we are with our title card, which I'll have a little bit more to say about later. But as shown on Dan's charts, 2 of the earliest theaters in our area were ground level open air theaters. And this was a very popular thing, especially in outlying areas of the city. There were lots of them, and they were called Airdome theaters, an appealing term for a place to go on a hot summer night.
And Gil, I think you need to click on that icon down on the lower right-hand side.
Oh yeah, wait a second. This one here?
Yeah, that one there. And
oh, thank you.
And,
okay.
we thank our viewing audience for being so kind to us in this first Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group live webinar. So go ahead, Gil.
Yeah, I don't know about you guys, but I need all the tech advice I can get dealing with it. All right. So the Moorish Garden was on 110th Street between Broadway and Riverside Drive. It opened in October 1913 and lasted at least until 1914. And there in the background, you can see on 110th Street, that's the, the Henry Hudson Apartments and Henry Hudson Annex. Jim, you were gonna make a point about 110th. It's a very special street at that time.
Yeah, if we talk enough about our Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group, people will go to our website, upperwestsidehistory.org, and in our blog, there's a superb article that will astound you about an area on 110th Street written by one of our fellow members, Pam Tice, about an area called Little Coney Island, and it was pejorative. It was not a nice area. So enough said, but if you go to the website, upperwestside.com, you can read about it. And now, Gil, back to you on 110th Street.
Okay. So here was another Airdome theater. This one was actually called the Airdome, and it was entered from 109th Street between Central Park West and Manhattan Avenue. That was opened in 1911, and we found a quote from a movie trade paper that praised it as the best appointed Airdome in New York City, with uniformed attendance, excellent projection, and an illuminated program announcer. We don't know how long it operated, but it still appears on a 1919 map. Now, there were also open-air theaters on rooftops, and one of those was just down the street from the Airdome at the southwest corner of Manhattan Avenue and 109th Street. This was the Manhattan Photoplay. It opened in 1914, a fully enclosed movie theater, but it also had a 630-odd open-air theater on the roof, which operated in the summertime. Remember, this was before air conditioning. In the late 1940s, it showed Spanish language films and was renamed The Brook. And in the early 1960s, it was converted to a Pentecostal church, the Arco di Rifugio, which is still there. And this is one of only two theaters above 96th Street whose buildings still survive. The other one, of course, is the Metro.
Gil, I'll mention that when we do neighborhood tours, we occasionally pass by this building. And one time we were very fortunate to be invited in, and you could see elements of the old theater. So in the future, when times get better and we do more of our neighborhood tours, myself and another one of our Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group members, Lisa Krisman, will undoubtedly pass this theater again, talk about it. This is also, Gil, if I recall, another theater that's connected for a while with William Fox. He's in my book on notable New Yorkers of Bloomingdale, Morningside Heights, because he lived in the neighborhood. But there are a bunch of theaters. I'm sure you'll touch upon a few.
Yes, we'll touch upon at least one more. Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah. Good. All right. Here's an old map showing the Nemo Theater at the southeast corner of 110th and Broadway. And this has a very interesting backstory. From the 1850s until Prohibition, the biggest single business in Bloomingdale was a Lion Brewery. It employed about 2,000 people and took up parts of 3 city blocks around 108th and Columbus. And it included a 2-acre beer garden that was connected to the main brewery buildings by a bridge over Columbus Avenue. Well, in 1879, when the 9th Avenue Well was built, that bridge had to be taken down. And the brewery eventually sold the beer garden site to developers, but it got this site at the southeast corner of Broadway and 110th and built a large new beer hall called the Lion Palace. And this was just after Columbia University had relocated to Morningside Heights. So in addition to selling beer to thirsty Columbia students, the Lion Palace offered music, dancing, and in warm weather, a rooftop theater with vaudeville acts. The whole stretch of 110th Street, of course, had a scandalous reputation, as Jim mentioned, as a Little Coney Island. Well, when Prohibition came along, the Lion Palace had to shut down, and it was replaced by the 923-seat Nemo Theater, designed by well-known theater architect Thomas W. Lamb. And the name Nemo might have come from Jules Verne's Captain Nemo, but more likely after Little Nemo, a cartoon drawn by Winsor McCay, which was a very popular comic strip in the early 20th century. Now, the Nemo was pretty well taken care of by successive owners. And in 1940, its old marquee on the right was replaced by the new one on the left, a backlit type, which was the kind you would find on a major downtown movie house. The Nemo lasted until 1953, when it was converted into a supermarket. If you don't remember it as a movie house, you might still remember it as a D'Agostino. The building was torn down in the early 2000s and replaced by a Columbia University apartment building, which now has that H marked in the at street level. Jim, you had something about the Columbia Lion and the West End Bar?
Yeah, a few things. One is I was curious a few years back about whether there was any connection between the Lion Brewery, which gave rise to the Lion Palace, which gave rise to Thomas W. Lamb's Nemo Theater, if there was any connection between that lion and the lion mascot of Columbia University. And I'm convinced, but subject to somebody else's research, that there really is no connection there. Of course, the Lion Palace, which was the hangout for Columbia students, as Gil said, after Columbia moved up into the area in the 1890s, it was the new hangout became the West End. The West. Say it again.
Bar, wasn't the West End Bar?
Yeah, I guess it was a bar, but that was the hangout for years and years and years. And curiously enough, that kind of morphed into, for a while, it didn't last long, but Bernheimer and Schmidt, which became the owners for a while of the successor to the Lion Brewery. But we digress. So my apologies, Gail. Let's get you back into some theater history.
All right, back up from that digression. All right. Now, another vanished old-timer started out as the Riverview, then became the Keystone, and was finally known as the Carlton. And there are some echoes of the Nemo story in the history of this theater. In the early 1900s, there was a very ritzy two-story restaurant known as the Carlton Terrace at the southwest corner of Broadway and 100th Street. Now, there's some evidence that an outdoor theater opened next door to the Carlton Terrace restaurant in the fall of 1912. And if so, it didn't last very long because the fully enclosed Riverview opened on this site the following year, 1913. 5 years later, it was renamed the Keystone. Meanwhile, Prohibition had come along and the Carlton Terrace restaurant was done in by that. And in 1922, it was torn down and replaced by a hotel, initially called the Carlton Terrace, after the restaurant, but later renamed the Whitehall. In 1932 or 33, the Keystone was extensively renovated, given this Art Deco facade, nifty Art Deco facade, and renamed the Carlton after the vanished restaurant. The theater operated until 1953, when it was converted to something called the Carlton Terrace Ballroom. And in 1980, it was converted again to a supermarket. And it was torn down in the early 2000s for the Ariel West, that very tall apartment building now on the site. Jim, you had something on the architect for the theater.
Yeah, the Keystone Theater that we're looking at in the photograph here was designed by an architect, Raymond Irera. And as much as we know architects by name from Manhattan, I didn't recognize the name, but I found out he did design the earlier Thalia Theater, not the modern Leonard Nimoy Thalia Theater, but the old Thalia Theater that many of us went to actually. He was resident in Queens, did a lot of residential development there. The earlier theater on this site was designed by Hertz of Hertz and Talent. That's a name I think some of us will recognize.
Yeah, big theater.
Yeah, and they designed at least 3 of the theaters that were on 42nd Street in Times Square area. They also designed the Brooklyn Academy of Music, a very majestic theater for concert venues. And that's all I have to say, Gil. Thanks.
Okay. Now, three of Bloomingdale's former theaters were within the area that was demolished in the 50s to build Parkwest Village and Frederick Douglass houses. Here's one of them called the Parkwest. Had just under 600 seats, and it began showing as early as 1911 and was in operation as late as 1948. And there you see it on an old Bromley map. Jim, you have something on the name Parkwest, right?
Yeah, it's funny. The larger area, the Upper West Side, sometimes seems to struggle with names. And I know historically they weren't sure what to call it. Today we call it the Upper West Side, but for a while, a lot of the areas as it was developed from the 1870s and 80s and 90s was called the West End. But another term, figure of speech that was used extensively was Park West. There was a Park West Hospital. There still is. In fact, the successor building to the Park West Hospital is still on West 76th Street. But there was a Park West Hotel on Central Park West and about 107th Street, Park West Presbyterian Church. This building also, when we looked at the image, kind of underscores what Dan Armstrong said previously. And I'm going to say it again because it's so profound. Dan made us realize this. Within a 36-month period in 1911, 12, and 13, 2/3 of all the theaters were built in our area. And this image kind of, I think, tells you that it's dated to that period. And again, before talkies, before multiple reel films were very, very common. If we had Gary Dennis in on the chat here, he could probably wax eloquently for a couple hours about how the length of movies and the size of the screen and all that stuff developed. But this one image is really wonderful. And the location of this, again, on 99th Street between Amsterdam and Columbus, it's now this is embedded in the property that's, Park West Village.
And by the way, about these pre-talkie theaters, we were in the pre-show before 5:30. We were talking about this card file that Jim discovered, compiled in the last century by a gentleman named Michael Miller. That he notes with nearly every theater, or with most of the theaters, who built the organ, what kind of an organ it had, or what kind of music facilities it had. So musical accompaniment, soundtracks were not yet invented, was a very important part of the planning and furnishing of a theater. Okay, now this is, let me see, yeah, this is the third of those theaters that was within the urban renewal area. And this was called the Rose. It was on the south side of 102nd, very close to Amsterdam Avenue, and was opened from 1926 to about 1940 or 41. Now this photo was probably from 1936 based on the movie on the marquee. That's George Arliss in Mr. Hobo. But it's interesting to note the street repair going on here. You're looking west, and very dimly you might see the Palisades in the background across the Hudson River. And here we are with a street repair project being done by the WPA, the New Deal Works Projects Administration. Now here, this is the location, to make that more clear, of the Rose. Again, on the south side of 102nd, just a little bit in from Amsterdam Avenue. And here's a view of the Rose in 1940. You'll notice it's been given a new marquee. And on the right, you see what the location is now. It's part of that athletic field at the southeast corner of 102nd and Amsterdam. Now, yet another theater within the urban renewal area, built relatively late, was the Arden. Was opened in 1934 at the northwest corner of 103rd and Columbus. And in this photo from 1939 or 40, you're looking north and you see overhead the tracks of the 9th Avenue L, which ran on Columbus Avenue until it was shut down in June 1940 and was torn down a few months after that. Now, here's the Arden on the lower right here, see at the corner of 103rd. And on the other end of the block, a little bit hard to make out, I'm sure, but there's a building labeled Home for Aged Females. And that is now the Hosteling International building where this presentation would have been held if it were not for the COVID-19. Of the 3 theaters within the urban renewal area, the Arden was the last to be opened and the last to shut down before the bulldozers came along. About 1952, it switched to Spanish language films and changed its name to the Caribe. And it continued to operate until about 1955 when it was demolished for the Frederick Douglass houses. Now, by far, the most important concentration of theaters in our area was the Riverside-Riviera Complex, which took up the entire west block front of Broadway between 96th and 97th Street. That's over there. It was a strategic location in the early 20th century because the 96th Street station was a major junction on the new IRT subway. And within a few years of its subway's opening in 1904, this stretch of Broadway had effectively become a satellite of Times Square with theaters, restaurants, dance halls, billiard parlors, etc. And at the northwest corner of 96th and Broadway was the 1,700-seat Riverside Theater. It was built in 1911 by William Fox, the Fox of what later became 20th Century Fox. But at that time, he was primarily a theater owner. Now, although the Riverside was equipped to show films, it was primarily intended as a vaudeville theater. However, Fox ran into problem with B.F. Keith and Edward Albee, who were the powerful theater owners and agents who controlled the bulk of vaudeville bookings in the United States and Canada. And they just refused to supply vaudeville acts to the Riverside, and they essentially forced Fox to sell out to them. Keith, by the way, was the K of RKO, which stood for Radio Keith Orpheum. And his partner, Albee, interestingly, was the adoptive father of the playwright Edward Albee. Now, the Riverside also had on its roof an open-air movie theater with about 850 seats. This photo is from about 1928. Now, after relinquishing the Riverside, Fox built a more elaborate theater building on the northern half of the block. There it is over here. Interestingly, the original building permit says 2-story theater and stores, but somehow the project got to be a lot bigger. At its base was the Riviera, which was a little bit larger than the Riverside, and it was also designed for stage shows. Both the Riverside and the Riviera were leased at different times to the Schubert brothers for what was then known as the Subway Circuit. And this was a series of theaters around the city where plays, after finishing a Broadway run, would be presented locally before setting out on a national tour. The Riviera and the Riverside were both very convenient for testing tour logistics, because until the 1930s, the New York Central Railroad had a freight depot at the foot of 96th Street. Now, these touring theater shows, they all went by rail. And since there was a rail station near here, stage sets could be unloaded and trucked only 2 blocks to either theater's stage door.
Gil, before you leave this image, can I mention that in that treasure trove of theater history we found from Michael Miller's collection, this is that fellow we referred to recently, he mentions that the general architect for this building, because it's pretty impressive, again, this is Broadway between 96th and 97th Street on the west side. The general architect for this, according to him, is John Duncan. Duncan designed the Grand Army Arch in the Arch in Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn, but is more famously known as the architect of Grant's Tomb.
I see. So he's made his mark on the Upper West Side.
That's for sure. Yeah.
Well, here, let me get to this one here. Now, here is a view of the Riviera Theater building. Now, this has Thomas W. Lamb as the architect, but he was likely the architect of the theater because that was his specialty. Above the main auditorium, with a separate entrance from Broadway, was a 1,024-seat Japanese roof garden reached by 2 elevators. Now, it's shown in the building photo on the left. See over here? It has its own slightly smaller marquee and lobby. Now, the only illustration we have shows that although it was called a roof garden, it had its own roof or canopy of some sort. And Michael Miller, in that card file, describes it as glass enclosed. So it was not a fully enclosed masonry theater, and therefore they had some way of ventilating it and letting the breeze come through in the summertime. Now, the Japanese garden was shut down in the late 1930s by the buildings department or the fire department, because of inadequate fire escapes. And after that, it was sporadically rented out for theatrical rehearsal space or commercial film shoots. The Riverside Roof Theater also seems to have shut down by the 1930s. Now here's another, here we are back at that view of the Riverside-Riviera block front. Now this is from about 1974, not long before it was demolished. The upper floors in those days had a variety of businesses. These multi-story head houses were rented out to things like Chess City, which was a long-time mecca for chess players. And Jim, do you remember that presentation on legal history of the Upper West Side?
Bob Piggott, sure.
Yeah. He writes that there was an actual city magistrate's courtroom on the upper floor of the Riverside building. Now, in 1974, a developer by the name of Christopher Boomis bought the site for a proposed 35-story apartment tower atop an Alexander's department store. He began demolishing the Riverside, but the project became mired in litigation, as well as charges of bribery. And other developers took over the apartment project and completed it, minus the department store, in 1984. And you see at the lower right here, it's the ground floor level of the building that's there now, the Columbia Apartments. Now, although the Riviera Riverside complex is long gone, there's an interesting legacy of it. In the 1920s, when the Riverside, the Riviera, the two rooftop theaters, and all, were all operating simultaneously, they could hold over 5,000 people. And additional thousands passed each evening on the way to dance halls, billiard parlors, restaurants, and whatever. This huge concentration of people represented a significant, shall we say, containment problem. And in response to it in 1927, the city built a comfort station on the center mall of Broadway. It provided relief to stressed bladders for decades, but in the 1970s, it had become notorious as a site for drug dealing, and the city shut it down. It was vacant for about 20 years until 1986, when the West Side Arts Coalition restored it and reopened it as a community center and art gallery. And it also has toilets. And Jim, you said had something about the architect here?
Yeah, the architect is Charles B. Myers. In our neighborhood, he designed the Whitehall on Broadway and 100th Street. Mm-hmm. Yeah, probably most famous. You touched upon it, Gil, with one of the theaters, but that's where George Gershwin rented a room, I believe, to finish his composition, An American in Paris. Of course, he composed Rhapsody in Blue at 501 West 110th Street. But the architect of this building, Charles B. Myers, is more known for his work in designing hospitals, the Bellevue Psychiatric Pavilion, Bronx, Lebanon, Morrisania Hospital, Seaview and Willowbrook down in Staten Island, those tuberculosis hospital down there. Daughters of Jacob Hospital in the middle of the Bronx, a fabulous structure. The Silver Clinic, the Charles Silver Clinic at Beth Israel, and also the Jewish Memorial Hospital for Joint Diseases. What have you got next, Gil?
Okay. Well, a handful of theaters along Broadway in our area survived until relatively recent times. These include the Essex Edison near 103rd, the Metro near 99th, and the Olympia at the corner of 107th. Now here's a photo, a little bit fuzzy because it's a screen grab from a movie. The Essex was built in 1913, and for most of its life, it showed second and third run films. Sometime in the 60s, it started to show Spanish language films, and its name was changed to the Edison. Now, this picture from 1968 is actually a scene from the movie Madigan, starring Richard Widmark. And that's the source of the title slide that you saw earlier. Now, but this is interesting because if you notice on the right of this picture, you can just see a little bit of the above ground subway entrance building on the center mall of Broadway, similar to the one that still exists on the south side of 72nd Street, but that was demolished a few years later. In 1988, the Edison was bought, renovated, became the Columbia, showed first-run films such as Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but that lasted only a couple of years until it reverted to late-run movies. For a while after it closed in 1993, you might remember it as a Lucille Roberts gym. It was torn down about 2005 to make way for a Columbia University staff apartment building, the one with the Gristides. It's street level. That's the one you see at the right over here. Let's take another look at that movie still used on our title slide. As Detective Madigan, Richard Widmark nabs a suspect as he emerges from watching a movie at the Edison. I don't recognize the actors on either side, but there you see Widmark in one of his rare, fairly positive roles. And there's the dwarf actor Michael Dunn in front of the one-time lunch counter at the corner of Broadway and 104th. Now that's the building now occupied by the city MD. And it's this corner which is currently being restored under the supervision of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, repairing the damage where the wall was torn out to create this open air lunch counter here. One of the few Bloomingdale movie houses that remained in business into the 21st century was the Olympia at 107th and Broadway across the street from Strauss Park. It opened in 1914. For a period in the 60s, it showed Spanish language films, then was converted to a 4-screen multiplex, then remodeled again with 2 screens. And in its final incarnation, with 1,100 so seats, it showed second runs of major Hollywood films. It was closed in 2003 and replaced by the 20-story apartment building you see on the right. For a while in about 1998, the film Titanic ran for several weeks at the Olympia. Now there's one scene with Isadora and Ida Strauss hugging each other while the water rushes into their cabin. And one can wonder how many of the thousands of people who saw the film Titanic at the Olympia realized that the elderly couple on the screen were real people who lived 3 blocks from where they were sitting, and that the park and statue across the street is a memorial to them. And Jim, you had something about the name Olympia?
Yeah, I've had a bug in my a bee in my bonnet, or whatever the metaphor, the figure of speech is about this theater having the same name as Oscar Hammerstein I, the great impresario. His large movie theater on Broadway, east side of Broadway, between 44th and 45th Street, was called the Olympia. You and I know, Gil, that later on Oscar Hammerstein I lived at 949 West End Avenue, right across the street from what is today Strauss Park. So he would have been right across the street from this Olympia Theater. Is there some connection there? Was it named in his honor? Who knows? I also, in some of my simple research, noticed that in 1914, when it opened, they advertised that they had a screen 9 feet tall, 25 feet wide, supposedly the largest movie theater screen in the world. I don't know who would challenge that, but I found that interesting. The owner of the theater was a developer, a fellow who made millions in Manhattan real estate, a fellow by the name of Henry Korn. He lived at 926 West End Avenue. And he was the fellow that actually purchased the property to develop this theater. So, and it was designed by an architect, Victor Hugo Kohler. Kohler did a bunch of theaters, mostly down on the lower east side, the Graham Street Theater and a couple of others. But he famously did the Lafayette Theater up in Harlem. That's legendary with a lot of Harlem Renaissance history. So, but Gil, take us to your next theater.
Okay, but you said that Mr. Korn lived at 926
Right.
West End. Well, in that case, he was a neighbor of Oscar Hammerstein I, so it's not out of the question.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, now, as you know, the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group generally focuses on the area between 96th and 110th. But, you know, we kind of stretch our boundaries now and then as the occasion calls for it. And it would be arbitrary not to include theaters a little bit south of 96th Street because they were an integral part of that early 20th century entertainment center centered on the 96th Street subway station. And so leaving aside the pandemic shutdown, the 2 theaters at 95th Street, the Symphony Space and the Thalia, are the only former movie theaters that are still, let's say, entertainment venues. Now, this site also has an interesting connection to the Titanic. When the Titanic went down, one of the people who lost their lives was John Jacob Astor IV. And with his death, his son, Vincent Astor, who was then 20 years old, inherited one of America's largest fortunes. Now, young Vincent had an interest in social issues and sometimes put money into projects with a social dimension. In 1915, he built a 2-story public market at the southwest corner of Broadway and 95th with the idea of making fresh meat and produce more available to this uptown neighborhood. There was a main floor here, and then there was a lower floor because you see the slope of the hill here. But the Astor Market was not a success and was soon bleeding money. And in 1917, the Astor estate sold it to the restaurateur Thomas J. Healy, who had recently had great success with a cabaret in the Lincoln Center, what's now the Lincoln Center area. A cabaret that featured ice shows. So Healy acquired this market building. He installed shops along the street, and then behind them, he created a skating rink called the Crystal Palace. But financially, that didn't work out either. And in 1918, he converted the skating rink space to a 1,400-seat movie theater called the Symphony, which you see at the left here. For decades, it was a neighborhood mainstay, showing mostly second and third run films. But by the 1970s, it was struggling, open only intermittently. Sometimes it was used for wrestling. In January 1978, the theater was rented just for a one-shot event by 2 local men, the director Isaiah Sheffer and the conductor Alan Miller, for a marathon concert built as wall-to-wall Bach. The concert was so successful that it led to the creation of Symphony Space, which has become one of the city's major cultural venues. It's nationally known for its selected short series syndicated on NPR and for things like the annual observance of Bloomsday with all-day readings from James Joyce's Ulysses. In 1990, the organization gained control of the underlying real estate and entered into a deal with a developer. They tore down most of the old Astor Market, renovated the interior of the former Symphony Theater, and then built a 20-story apartment building over and around it. The renovated theater now has 900 seats. Around the corner on 95th Street, downhill from Symphony Space, is the Leonard Nimoy Thalia Theater. The original Thalia, which you see on the left here, was built in 1931 in what had been the fish market in the lower level of the Astor Market building. Healy initially converted into a restaurant and dance hall called the Sunken Garden, but after his death, it was replaced by the 299-seat Thalia Theater, which became New York's preeminent art film house. Its fans included Woody Allen and Martin Scorsese, and it appears in a scene in Woody Allen's Annie Hall. The original Thalia closed down in 1987 and had to be demolished to construct the new building bridging over the Symphony. But in 2002, it was rebuilt and reopened as a new 168-seat auditorium created largely with funding from the actor Leonard Nimoy, hence its present name.
Gil, by the way, I had a quick thought. Is there any chance, and I feel about 65% confident on this, the Vincent Astor who developed the Astor Market that led ultimately to Symphony Space and Leonard Nimoy Thalia Theater, that Vincent Astor, wasn't he the husband of Brooke Astor?
Absolutely.
Okay.
When he died in 1949, and I'm told that he left her this, he left her this foundation and made her this head of it. It was hundreds of millions of dollars. And his message to her was, have fun with it. And she did. And with that, she was particularly supportive of the New York Public Library. Mm-hmm. And in the end, her aim was to use up the entire, let us say, all the assets of the foundation within her lifetime, which she did. And of course, she lived a number of more years until her death at the age of 105. So of all the theaters that existed, the Metro is the only one that's a designated New York City landmark, which is why its marquee and its extraordinary Art Deco facade have survived. It opened in 1933 as the Midtown, and see that's the name on the left. Picture was taken in 1940. Its architects were Boak and Paris, who were also the designers of 315 Riverside Drive and a couple of other apartment buildings in our area. In the 1960s, it was twinned. The balcony became a separate auditorium, and it was renamed the Metro Twin. And in the dark decades of the 1970s and 80s, it showed second-run films and sometimes adult films. And in the 1986 movie Hannah and Her Sisters, the Metro is where the chronically depressed Mickey, played by Woody Allen, has a transformative experience while watching the Marx Brothers in Duck Soup. The Metro went through a couple of more owners and renovations, but closed for good in 2005. The air rights were sold, transferred to the adjacent lot for the construction of the Ariel East apartment building. The theater itself was gutted and offered for rent as a retail space. And from time to time, there have been plans for it, including an Alamo Drafthouse cinema, but all have fallen through. So 15 years after showing its last film, it's still vacant. Now, several weeks ago, the West Side Rag reported that its owner was in discussions with yet another possible tenant, but we'll have to keep our fingers crossed on that. Jim, you had something about that big cartouche or whatever on the facade.
Yeah, we call that a rondelle, that round glazed terracotta item. If you're ever on Broadway between 99th and 100th Street, look up to it. And there's some wonderful images online that you can look at it. And the question at hand is, was that rondelle a design of the great Hildreth Maier? If you don't know Hildreth Maier's work, although you probably do, she's done the rondelles above the entranceway to Radio City Music Hall, and she's done various items, similar items around town, usually on Art Deco buildings such as this one. Gil and I, and maybe somebody else, we tried to get to the bottom of this, and we're not 100% there, but in talking to a descendant of Hildreth Maier, she might not have done this. Although if you compare this particular one to the ones above Radio City Music Hall, you'll see that the themes are kind of the same and the style is certainly the same, but it's still a little bit of an open question in our area. So, but thank God the building's landmarked, and who knows, maybe in the future we'll get a more definitive answer.
Yeah, somebody'll turn up some cache of documents that's been hidden in a bottom file drawer for a century.
Yeah.
Okay, so this brings us to our closing shot. Again, from the movie Vanilla Sky, where Cameron Diaz, having been jilted by Tom Cruise's character, drives them both off the Riverside Drive overpass at the foot of 96th Street.
Yeah, boy,
okay.
What an image to end with. But I think we'll be prepared to take a few questions. Behind the scenes, Michael Gonzalez, who's another esteemed member of the Bloomingdale Neighborhood History Group, has been looking at the questions on the chat. He'll feed them to Dan, Gil, myself. At this point, though, I'd really like to thank Dan and Gil, and especially Michael for handling all of this technical stuff and making it all work. And thanking all of you. A number of you signed on early. That was wonderful. We had a pre-show chat, so to speak. And now we're ready for any questions. And please go to our website again, upperwestsidehistory.org, to see what we have coming up. Maybe you'll read some of our old blogs, which have wonderful history. And hopefully you'll tune in on our upcoming presentations. So, Michael, what do you say about questions?
So we have a few questions from Liz Dennis. The first one would be if we had any information on why the Rose Theater was named Rose. Or Rose Theater.
Rose, yeah.
Sorry.
Nope. No, I don't have any information.
No, we can only speculate. There's a fellow, Marshall Rose, who is a large real estate owner in New York City, connected also with New York Public Library. But it might have just been a rose flower image or something. We don't, unfortunately, have it. You know, some of these a lot of naming is very whimsical. So
could have been the name of the owner's wife, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, so then another one would be if we know any movies that were actually filmed in the Bloomingdale neighborhood or made in this neighborhood.
Yeah, funny you should ask. We did a whole presentation on that about 3, maybe 4 years ago. Again,
I believe that's on our YouTube channel at this point.
With Gary Dennis's help, we strung together a number of films. We had to leave a number out. And we actually showed them at the Hostel International building. So maybe we'll reprise that in the next few years.
All right. And then around what age was Oscar Hammerstein living in 949?
Well, it was toward the end. It was the last few years of his life. Yeah. So
do you have
he was a very esteemed figure. He built the Harlem Opera House. He built the Hammerstein Opera House on 34th Street, and a couple of major legitimate theaters in the Times Square area.
Yeah, I'll give a little more context to that. We know Strauss Park. Before it was Strauss Park, which got dedicated in 1913, I believe, it was called Bloomingdale Square. And it was called Bloomingdale Square because the Bloomingdale Dutch Reformed Church came on to the site of 947 or 949 West End Avenue around 1905, 6, or 7. And that's when... And then before that, it was called Schuyler Square. And indeed, there was a large developer in the area called Charles Schuyler, but New York City records prove that it was named after General Philip Schuyler, the father-in-law of Alexander Hamilton. So we can kind of deduce that Oscar Hammerstein I probably lived there around 1900 to 1915, Gil, I'm guessing?
No, I think it was later than that. 940, that building wasn't built until after the church was torn down.
That's right, 1916, that 12-story
yeah,
building.
1915
yeah.
or so.
Yeah. So Gil's kind of correcting me, refining my thinking. Probably right at 1916, maybe a few years after, he lived in 949 West End Avenue. It's still there, a 12-story building.
Or maybe Hammerstein moved in there because there was a theater named Olympia across the street. Now, there's a question here. Wasn't the Symphony a dance hall first, hence the shape and lack of a rake to the floor? Well, as far as we know, it wasn't a dance hall, but it was a skating rink, which would also have had a lack of rake to the floor.
Yeah, it had that horseshoe balcony, as I remember correctly. The Garrison Keillor Prairie Home Companion show was done there a few times.
Really? Oh.
Dwilio Cart Theater Group came
Charlie
there.
Cart, yeah, right, yeah.
Yes.
We have Ethel Sheffer in the crowd also that wants to add a few points to the story of Symphony and Thalia.
Oh, yeah, sure.
All right, so I'll allow him to talk and then
That's
see.
Hi, Ethel.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes, we can.
Correct.
Thank
Loud
you.
and clear.
Thank you so much. Well, this is terrific. Just a few things quickly to add to the Symphony and Thalia. Yes, as I think Gil said, the Thalia became the Sunken Gardens restaurant. In fact, but also the Symphony was in fact a skating rink, and though the theater has been much renovated, you can see that the remnants of the skating rink with the hall of the theater with the seats, and on the side, on each side, the two balconies, and that was for people, relatives, others to see the skaters below. And the Thalia was a unique movie theater for generations of people who came to the place to see genuine art films. And I can even remember when I was young going there to see, French films that you couldn't see any other place. The last thing to tell you quickly is a small anecdote. When after Isaiah was, developing the theater and he called one day about 10, 12, 13 years after they rescued the theater and it became a theater. And he mentioned to me, you're not going to believe this, but I was standing getting a little air when a man approached the theater and he was dressed in a Savile Row suit. And he then announced himself as, I am Lord Astor. And it was indeed, several generations later, a descendant. But he, along with others who shall be nameless now, after they began to appreciate that the theater helped to make the Upper West Side, if you like, rejuvenated, and it became a valuable property, which then they wanted to demolish because they originally let the poor theater people turn the place into a theater in order to save them on taxes as the theater became nonprofit and was exempt. Then as life became allegedly more prosperous and so on, they wanted to take the theater, and then they waged a huge lawsuit to demolish the entire block. And Astor was one of the parties to that, along with others, to bring it back. And they lost in a fluke decision, which gets into the second year law school curriculum as one of the most extraordinary cases in New York. One other quick thing, the Boomer site and the current building, the Columbia, was developed by Zeckendorf. Mm-hmm. Finally, one of the great names, in development history.
Right. Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ethel.
Thank you.
We have Leslie who says she recalls a big trench in the auditorium of the Thalia Theater. Does anyone know the reason for that?
The trench?
Well, it had a very unusual, I think it was called a reverse parabolic floor.
Yes, that's the word. Yes, it was originally, in part because of the subway and in part because of the remnants of the slope of the street and the Sunken Gardens restaurant. When it became the Thalia, it was indeed what was called a reverse parabolic curve. And believe me, it was beloved and a very difficult theater to see the screens because it was such a strange angle. And for those who went to the Thalia as the great art house, I think there were two brothers running it. And as you try to see the movie screen, they would be walking up and down in this strange curve, arguing and shouting at each other all the time, which was all part of the experience. And the last thing, just to tell you, because you all used, and it's quite correct indeed, that it is indeed called the Leonard Nimoy Theater because of the extraordinary generosity of Leonard Nimoy, but that really happened relatively later into the 2000s. And when finally, with all the lawsuits and so on, I can always remember Isaiah and others saying, wait, we're renovating, we're doing the symphony, but could we get the Thalia to have as a second house? And they were able to, and it was Leonard. They sat across the street at the coffee shop then called the Key West. And Isaiah said, look, this could be another theater. And Leonard Nimoy said, I remember that, and you know what? I'll do it. And it actually happened in the coffee shop now, the Manhattan Diner, that Leonard's generosity and his saving of the theater was so wonderful for it to continue.
Wow.
Okay, thank you. All righty, well.
Well, we've run about an hour and 20 minutes. Michael, we have any other pressing questions? Otherwise, I think we'll let people resume their day.
Yeah.
We have about three more questions, maybe,
Okay.
if you guys want to take
Sure.
those on.
All right. shoot,
So
yeah.
a quick question is, were any of the movie theaters ever equipped with 7mm projections? Or does anyone know?
No.
No, sorry.
That would be
All
one.
right.
That would be one for Gary Dennis, maybe.
Oh, so Gary Dennis is on this actually.
Oh, yeah.
If he wants to, if he
Should we
wants
put
to
him on the
come out
spot?
and speak. He's been very active throughout this. Let's see if he's.
Okay, I'm back. I'm on. Can you hear me?
Gary.
Hey, Jim, who's the guy behind you? There's a guy sitting there behind you.
Uh,
Now it just moved. Oh my God. Oh, that guy.
this guy,
Was it Jack Benny? All right.
that's Jack Benny, yep.
Oh yeah, look at that. All right.
Oh,
Nice guy.
Wow.
Hey, and Jack Benny performed at the Riverside. So the 70mm as a projection thing, that was maybe at the Riverside. I think the Riverside had a longer throw from the projection booth to the screen than the Riviera did, because they, like you said, they were both built for live performance. They had to add projection booths. I believe they added both of them into those theaters. And what Lamb was really good at was acoustics. So his theaters were just the best. I mean, you had to sing over an orchestra to 1,800 people. You were going to do it in a Lamb theater without a microphone. They didn't have microphones back then. So the only one I could think of that maybe had 70mm may have been when they redid the Olympia from a quad, and this never happens. It went from a quad to a twin. They may have had it, but again, it's the shallowness. They need that room. You know, they can still have widescreen, that's no problem, but the 70mm with that big negative, you know, you're gonna need, I think, room for it. So I don't think there was maybe room. So that was part of it. You know, that was it. One thing I did remember about the Thalia is that dip in the theater and the floor, it was deliberate, and it had nothing to do with the subway as far as I can tell, but also may have had to do with the fact that it was an existing structure, and what's right underneath that theater, I don't know. Maybe there's like, you know, a basement that they didn't want to have to deal with lowering the basement to lower the floor to make a, you know, to get that clearance of a raked space, you know? So that's my guess. That, you know, why they also did it, but it worked. You never not saw the screen in that theater. No matter where you, I mean, it wasn't that big, so it was not a big deal. So that's
Okay.
my opinion.
Michael, next question.
All right, the last question didn't come from So Katie asked if Hammerstein went to Columbia, wouldn't he have lived in the Upper West Side then?
Well, the question probably refers to Oscar Hammerstein II, who is the grandson of Oscar Hammerstein, the great impresario. He did go to Columbia for sure. In fact, he met Richard Rogers there, even though they didn't collaborate till many years later. Rogers met Lorenz Hart, who was another person who lived in our neighborhood at 415 Central Park West. So Oscar Hammerstein II, or Oscar Hammerstein, who wrote Sound of Music, Carousel, Oklahoma, Sound of all of that stuff. He went to Columbia. Didn't have much to do with his grandfather, but his grandfather was a star in his own right, and clearly Oscar Hammerstein II was a star. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and then the last mention from Lisa Rosen wanted to know about the New Yorker, a bit more downtown.
That's for.
That's a Boke in Paris. It was a redo of an existing theater, and Boke in Paris did it.
Yeah, I think, yeah. Mm-hmm.
What was the cross street, Gary? Was
88 or 88th or 89? Because there was a Stoddard. No, it was 88, and it was the Adelphi, and then it was called the Yorktown, and then it became the New Yorker.
Right on Broadway.
Right, yeah, the entrance was on Broadway, and the theater itself was down the side street.
Yep. So maybe that'll be part of a future presentation.
Yeah,
but at this point, I want to thank everyone, and I especially want to thank Ethel Sheffer, who gave us some wonderful, insightful information, and Gary Dennis, who's the expert on so much of this stuff that Dan Gill and myself, Dan Armstrong, Gil Tauber, Jim Mackin, that we're presenting to you today. And again, look at our website, upperwestsidehistory.org, to see about future programs and other things that we'll be doing, and hopefully we'll get through these difficult periods. Until then, everyone, please stay well, stay healthy, and we'll see you soon enough. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.